So without further ado, let's talk about hyperinflation. So hyperinflation on Earth, we're all very familiar with Germany in between the wars, Zimbabwe in 2008. Now, hyperinflation in hell is something that's kind of a new frontier in economic research. And in fact, conventional wisdom has it that the economy of the afterworld is extremely stable. However, our research shows otherwise. We argue to the contrary, first of all, that there's chronic hyperinflation in hell, and that this is driven by the usual suspect, its massive increase in the money supply, which we call M4, both to contrast it with M1 through M3 in the terrestrial realm, and because in Mandarin and Cantonese the word for four sounds very much like the word for death. Now this is important because what's driving this massive increase in M4 is joss paper. So joss paper is part of religious traditions in some Asian countries where you burn fake money and it's supposed to send money to your ancestors in the afterworld. Our argument is that this burning of joss paper is actually massively increasing the money supply in the afterworld, a phenomenon that has been exacerbated by a technological advance that I'm going to show you now with this video. So this is how burning joss paper works, at least the old way. Right? This is how you send money to your ancestors in the afterworld. Now this is the new way of sending money to your ancestors in the afterworld. This is the Hell Banknote app. Tagline is, there's an app for everyone, even the dead ones. So I think you can see where this paper is going, but I'd like to start with a literature review. So there have been a number of papers about the afterworld, including this paper in the Journal of Political Economy from 1980. There's a book that came out last year called Do They Take Credit Cards in Heaven? And now both of these papers, these works were both extremely speculative. The third paper I want to tell you about is Jim Heckman's paper. Jim Heckman, of course, won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. His paper is called The Effect of Prayer on God's Attitude Towards Mankind. And this, of course, is an empirical piece. Now let's start with just some basic theory. So burning joss paper allows the living to create fiat money in the afterworld. In other words, everybody gets to be a central banker. Now, this sounds terrific. We've democratized central banking. It sounds awesome. But of course, economists and the dismal science suggest otherwise. Right, what we know is that, in fact, this is going to lead to a tragedy of the commons situation. Right, each family is going to supply their ancestors with an amount of money that vastly exceeds the social optimum. And in fact, the money supply M4 is only going to be limited by the marginal cost of production, which was close to zero before, and now, thanks to these iPhone apps, is now equal to zero. So this strongly suggests we're going to have hyperinflation, but of course, what about the empirical evidence? Now, empirical work on the afterworld is a difficult undertaking, so we're going to start with a stylized fact, and the stylized fact is that M4 has been increasing rapidly. Now, I have to confess that we actually couldn't confirm this, and that's why this is a stylized fact. And not an actual factual fact. We also couldn't find any data on, basic economic statistics like gross deathly product. And in fact, that leads us to a really stunning result, right, which is that finding accurate data for the afterworld may be even more difficult than finding accurate data for China. But you shouldn't abandon all hope. I will give you an example of empirical work concerning the afterworld. This is about population growth in the afterworld, which is, of course, driven by deaths on Earth. There are about 50 million deaths on Earth every year. And now, deaths on Earth are highly correlated with births on Earth. Correlation coefficient approaches 1. And in fact, the leading cause of death, of course, is birth. Now you may wonder how many people have ever been born. The Population Reference Bureau actually answers this question. In 2011, they estimated the number of people who have ever been born is about 108 billion people over the last 50,000 years. most of those people have died. So there are about 100 billion people in the afterworld. You add 50 million every year, that means that the population growth rate in the afterworld is only 0.05%. Very little. Now, what kind of implications can we draw from this? Well, you might think that the increase in M4 and money supply in the afterworld, one possible explanation is a Milton Friedman style monetarism. I mean, maybe there's just rapid real GDP growth in the afterworld, and so we need to increase M4 to keep up with that. Well, what could be causing this rapid real GDP growth? Could it be rapid growth in population? Clearly the answer is no. Now that leaves the possibility that there's rapid growth in real GDP per d capita. But this actually is a topic for further research on non-living standards. But this is only an entry to the real empirical triumph of our work, which stems from the theory of rational expectations. Now, rational expectations comes from Muth and Lucas and others. They argue that humans should have rational expectations about things like inflation and exchange rates on Earth. A little noticed corollary is that it is equally plausible that we have rational expectations about variables in the afterworld. The strength of the rational expectations approach was terrifyingly obvious, right? It allows us to infer the value of currency in the afterworld from observable behavior in the real world. I'll give you an example. These three pieces of Joss paper all purchased for the same amount of money. Rational expectations indicates that the exchange rate in the afterworld must be equal for these three types of Joss paper. In other words, $100 million must be equal to 100 million pounds, which must be equal to 500 euros. Now, some of you may be curious about the strength of the euro in the afterworld. I'm going to come back to that. Now, this, of course, tells us nothing about the numeraire, right? We need to know exactly what is the value of one of these currencies in order to figure out the rest. Now, the next piece of evidence I have is sort of the Rosetta Stone of economic research on the afterworld. It is these three bills all in the same currency. $50, $100, and $1,000 Joss paper bills all purchased for the same amount of money here on Earth. Now, what this tells us, if we think about rational expectations, is these three bills must have the same value in the afterworld. In other words, we are looking for a solution X to the equation 50X equals 100X equals 1000X. Now, I'm going to push off the solution details to the mathematical appendix and just get to the conclusion, which is that X is equal to 0. So this provides empirical proof that there has been massive hyperinflation in the afterworld. Now, a couple of really deep insights. One of them is that this explains the strength of the euro, which is really a false strength that comes about by multiplying by 0. The other deep insight is about fiat currencies here on Earth. Right, if you think about competitive markets, price is going to be equal to marginal cost, approximately equal to 0 for Joss paper. So how does the US government get currency to be worth more than the paper it's printed on? The answer is that there's not a competitive market, right? It has a monopoly. And this actually informs our policy recommendations. We think there is a tremendous need for necroeconomic reform. And they can sort of come in three levels. So at the basic level, we think religious institutions, temples and shrines should start teaching economics. The problem, of course, being that education is not always a sufficient solution to the tragedy of the commons. So we may have to go beyond that and have the Fed and other central bankers take over the underworld. In the extreme, we could just ban Joss paper, which would mean that people who want to send money to their ancestors in the afterworld would have to burn real currency. Now, we are confident that this dollarization will solve the problem of hyperinflation in the afterworld. Before we take these drastic measures, we think there should be a fact-finding mission to the afterworld, and that this fact-finding mission should include a diverse group of macroeconomists, hedge fund managers, central bankers, Ron Paul supporters, gold bugs, and the architects of the euro. Thank you very much. My name is Yoram Bauman.